When I met Blake, my life changed. I'd never had a real friend until I met him. Even in kindergarten, I'd be that weird kid who'd spend recess on his own in the corner. It was in the summer of 1993. Blake's family moved in a few streets down from us. His mother Lilibet, determined to worm her way into the country club, knocked on the door of the largest house in the suburb and presented my mom with a fresh peach cobbler. They too were inseparable from that day forth. Every time Lilibet would come around for a wine evening with my mother, she'd bring Blake along. I never knew what his father worked as, but I did know that he was only ever around on the weekends. I hit it off with Blake instantly. We'd spend long summer evenings upsetting wasp nests and drinking Hawaiian punch, while our mothers kept a loose eye on us from the porch. My backyard doesn't really end. Instead, it leads into the green blanket of Jefferson National Forest. Blake and I would spend hours playing in the maze of trees, building forts and sword fighting with sticks. We'd dare each other further and further into the woods. But eventually, one of us would always chicken out before we went too deep. Usually me. Blake was my best friend for 5 years. We'd still hang out every day, even after our parents had a major falling out. I suppose we both knew that we had no one else to fill our time with. He went missing on a sticky summer day in 1998. His mother had begrudgingly dropped him off at my house. My mother asked Blake about his day before we went out exploring, as we put it, into the forest. Once we were far enough from my house, Blake took out the flip knife he'd stolen from his father. We played around with it for a while, taking turns doing the slowest finger fillet imaginable and using it to sharpen twigs into arrows. It was while we were playing that stupid knife game that I managed to stab myself through my middle finger. I cursed and grimaced and tried not to cry in front of Blake. I slumped onto a rotting, moss-covered log and nursed my mutilated finger. For some reason, I thought blowing on it would help. Blake made an unhelpful joke before picking the knife up and sitting next to me. I told him I was fine, and he started to list off some facts he knew about tetanus. I shoved him off the log, and we both laughed. Blake got up, brushing the leaves off himself, and told me he'd just gotten a great idea. He said that while we had the knife, we should carve our names into a tree. That way, anyone who sees the message will know that Blake and Robbie are best friends. I told him it was a great idea, and that he should pick out the sturdiest tree he can find while I go get a plaster. Blake began his expedition, and I walked back to the house, holding my still bleeding figure in an old tissue. I didn't realize how close we were to my house until it quickly came into view, and I hoped my mother hadn't heard me swearing. She was lying back on a deck chair, reading a gossip magazine and sipping from a glass of white wine. She jumped up as soon as she noticed my hand. Soon after, my finger was lathered in germaline and wrapped in a Band-Aid. I lied and told my mother that I'd cut it on a particularly sharp stone. She seemed to buy it, or at least I thought she did. She told me to be more careful and sent me on my way, shaking her head and muttering something about me being reckless. I wandered back into the woods to look for Blake. I stumbled across the old fallen tree I'd been using as a bench, which lay just out of view of my house. I looked around, but didn't see Blake. I called his name and got no reply. I started to meander around, weary that Blake could jump out at me at any second. He was always like that, playing tricks on me. Once he left his grandmother's old doll that he knew I hated in my room after a sleepover. He still wishes that he'd been there to see my reaction. I'm wandering between the trees, further from my garden and deeper into the unrelinquishing forest. Something catches my eye. A metallic glint. I turn to see an old oak tree, its limbs tangled and broken like a car crash victim. It was the oldest tree on the property, as far we knew. It lay right on the invisible boundary where our land ended and the administration of the United States Forest Service began. I begged my father to let me build a treehouse on its branches when I was younger, but the answer was forever no. I took a step closer. I saw what had caught my eye. Blake's flip knife was sticking out of the bark, around shoulder height. I looked at it, puzzled, and grabbed the handle. With some effort, I managed to pull it out. Blake must have lodged it in deep. I felt the weight of it in my hand, trying to balance it on my index finger. Blake had cleaned my blood off the blade. I guess he picked the old oak as the tree we should carve our message into. I pocketed the knife and looked around. Still no sign of Blake. I still wasn't convinced that he wasn't just hiding behind a bush somewhere, ready to pounce on me as I walked past. I called his name again. No reply. Only the sound of wind echoing between the wooden mesh-entangled branches. Worry began to set in. I heard my mother call us in. Pizza was ready, apparently. All I'd had to eat that day was a stick of apple-flavored chewing gum that I had accidentally swallowed, so pizza was an alluring mistress. I looked around and spoke in no particular direction. Come on, Blake. Mom made pizza. Homemade this time as well. None of that frozen crap. I was sure that he'd hear me and come running out. Eventually. I made my way out of the forest and back towards my house. Where's Blake? My mother asked as I sat down on the picnic table. He's around somewhere, I replied. I reckon he was trying to prank me. He'll come crawling out of his hiding spot as soon as he smells this. We laughed and began to eat. By the time we'd finished, Blake's portion was still lying cold on his paper plate, now congealed in grease. Mom began to worry. She was like Blake's second mother, and practically was his mother when his parents were going through their divorce. As soon as I finished, she sent me back out to the forest to look for him. This time, she came with me. Half an hour later, there was still no sign. My mother made me walk her through our entire afternoon. I confessed to her that we'd been playing with a knife. I immediately felt like I shouldn't have. She berated me about safety, but stopped suddenly as she began to think the worst of what could have happened to Blake. She didn't tell me, not wanting to upset me, but I could tell what she was thinking. What if Blake had cut himself? Worse, what if he'd been running, knife in hand, and tripped on a root? My mother called Lilibet soon after. She arrived before the hour's end and started a screaming match with Mom as soon as she burst through our front door. Something about losing her sweet baby boy. I wasn't sure. I had my hands over my ears for most of it. The police came next. They assured us that since he'd only been gone for a little more than an hour, there shouldn't be anything to worry about. He was probably sitting by a tree, nursing a twisted ankle. Lilibet filled in a missing people's report just after sundown. The rest of the day was a hectic search. Eventually, my mother told me to go back inside and go to bed. I protested, wanting to be the one to find him, but eventually relented. She led me back to the house and tucked me into bed before she rejoined Lilibet. I managed to fall asleep, weariness winning the battle against worry. I was woken up by talking just outside of my bedroom window. I checked the time. 6:02. I rolled out of bed and went to my window and peered outside. There was a group of people congregated in the garden. A search party. A few carried torches, although it was already bright enough to see clearly. I recognized some of the men from around town. Mr. Hall, my geography teacher, was the first one to catch my eye. He gave me a sympathetic wave and went back to listening to the police officer who was organizing the group into smaller parties. Soon thereafter, they set off into the woods. By the time that I got up, Blake had been gone for 15 hours. It's a myth that you have to wait 24 hours to report someone missing. Really, you should do it as soon as their absence becomes suspicious. Some law enforcers do suggest waiting 24 hours, but that's just an advisory, or a polite way of saying, "Ma'am, could it be that your husband is just blackout drunk in a ditch somewhere?" That day, the search party found nothing. Not a piece of cloth or lost shoe. There was no trace of Blake at all. The police brought in sniffer dogs, which were equally ineffective. The searches began to peter out after 3 weeks. Local law enforcement explained there was simply nothing more they could do. Still, people didn't give up hope. Lilibet would spend hours on her own, wandering through the woods looking for her son. She'd often turn up at our house late at night, looking for a place to stay so she could resume the search as soon as her tired body allowed her. It was a wonder that she never got lost herself. Police suspicion immediately fell on my father, even though he was working at the time of the disappearance. He had a criminal record from his teenage years, nothing major, but they used it as rope to tie his noose. As the sheriff kept repeating that they had no new information, the townsfolk became increasingly agitated. They tried desperately to use my father as a scapegoat, a patsy. But there was nothing. No evidence that Blake had even left my backyard, let alone for a murder. My father avoided jail, but not the death of his reputation. My father lost his job. Although he was never convicted, the stigma of being the lead suspect in a missing child case was not good for a children's ombudsman. He couldn't find work anywhere in town. Months had passed now since Blake's disappearance. I was back to being friendless and heavily bullied at school. I'd still walk home with Blake every day, though, as his missing posters lined every lamppost from the school to my house. My mother began working again, being able to return to her position at the local women's college. It was enough to keep our family afloat, but not my parents' marriage. Their divorce was finalized on Millennium Eve. I knew it was coming, although I enjoyed ignoring the signs. My father spent most of 1999 drunk at home. High school was a nightmare, but at least it gave me a sense of normalcy. I like to think that I was a good student, not that it mattered. I had to drop out of college in 2008 to care for my mother. She passed away from lung cancer in 2009, leaving me alone with the family home and more debt than I'd be worth in a decade. I lost contact with my father after my mother's funeral. Last I knew, he was living in a trailer park near the coast. I should have sold the house. Anyone in my family I still talk to told me that. The place was far too big for one person. Too hollow. I should have sold it, but I didn't. Buried in the walls of that house were the memories of my happy childhood, and that was priceless. I did have to sell almost every item of furniture, every piece of jewelry, every last possession, just to keep my head above water. Worst of all, I had to work in retail. My life was at a dead end. Every day was the same as its predecessor, and will undoubtedly be the same as its successor. I'd wake up, go to work, come home, eat, drink, sleep, and wake up again the next morning. The only thing that kept me going was Lucy. She was a cashier at the small corner shop I worked at. She was a little younger than me. Her parents had kicked her out when she was 19. The art college she attended kicked her out as well a few short years later. She ended up back here and has been stuck in a cycle of part-time jobs ever since. We were good friends, as much as I wanted us to be more. We'd go out for drinks as often as we could, sometimes catch a movie at the local art house cinema. She's dated a few guys in the team I've known her, but nothing that didn't last more than a few weeks. I was comfortable with our friendship. I didn't want to end up like just another month-long romance. So, I kept acting like I was content with her calling me the brother she never had. If you're reading all of this and thinking that it sounds unhealthy and just a tad pathetic, then you're undoubtedly right. I just don't want to rock the boat. The night it happened began with me slumped across the front room sofa, gorging myself on off-brand cheese puffs and watching trash TV. I wiped the orange power from my fingers with my vest, picked up my phone, and messaged Lucy. "Do you want to come over for movie night?" It took her a while to reply. "Look out your window. It's the storm of the century outside." She had a point, I admit. It was the first big storm to hit us in 2016. It wasn't that bad now, but it was set to wreak havoc in a few hours. Lucy and I lived within a 10-minute walk of each other's houses. She'd usually pop over whenever she got frustrated with her housemate, which was often good movie weather. I chuckled at my own message. Lucy didn't reply for a few minutes. Long enough for my show about housewives to end another about fishermen on steroids to begin. Well, I took that as a no and set my phone back down on the coffee table. I rolled over and went back to watching the TV screen, regardless of whatever was being shown. I just switched my mind off. I didn't realize that I had fallen asleep until I was woken up. I groaned and slowly sat upright, the stale flavor of artificial cheese and Malibu on my breath. I sat there listening to the rain until I decided to get up and investigate the noise that dragged me awake. I stumbled through the living room and into the kitchen. I fumbled with the wall until my hand found the light switch, although I could tell what the problem was already. The light came on, and I saw that I'd left a window wide open. The curtains had caught the wind and knocked over a plant pot. The tiled floor was covered in dirt and bits of dead philodendron. I sighed and poured myself a glass of water, trying not to get mud on my slippers, as I sat down in what used to be my father's chair at the dinner table. I swished the water around in my mouth and turned the kitchen light off so I could see outside. I sat back down and stared at the swaying trees at the foot of my backyard. At times like this, all I can think about is Blake. I wondered if he was still out there somewhere. If I remembered correctly, the last theory from the county police was that he fell down a small cave entrance, one they, or anyone else, never could find. I spat the rinse back into my cup, then shrugged my shoulders and drank it. Suddenly, the room was filled with a spectacular light. I squinted as I saw lightning strike just beyond the tree line. It was over in a split second. Thunder followed immediately after. I laughed to myself, feeling sorry for all the dog owners in the neighborhood. I never had one, but Blake did, for a while. Charles, I think his name was. Blake would tell me about how Charles would howl and whimper his way through every storm. I stopped laughing when I saw the glow. It was faint at first, when slowly grew brighter. I got to my feet, leaned over the sink, pressing my forehead against the glass pane. There was definitely dull orange glow coming from the woods. Fire was the first thing that came to my mind. Back in June, a fire was started in a camper van lot. not all that far away. It burnt down a few people's livelihoods. The news reporters said that had been started by lightning. I began opening random drawers until I found a torch. I made sure it was working, grabbed a coat, and headed outside. I almost slipped on the wooden steps of the deck. I trudged across the garden, which had been turned to mud by the storm, and continued on towards the glow. Some cover from the rain was granted as I crossed the tree line. The beam of my torch fell over a mat of rotten leaves and twigs, a fallen log, and finally, an old oak tree. The bolt of lightning had split the thing almost in half. Part of the tree was strewn, still smoldering on the ground. The smell of charred timber overpowered the petrichor. The split edges of the oak were a ring of embers, the source of the orange glow that led me here. I took a step closer and was stopped by sudden realization. This was the tree Blake was intent on carving our names into. The tree I found his flick knife sticking out of. The tree I knelt at every year on the anniversary of his disappearance to pray to St. Anthony. Tears clouded my version as I realized I'd lost my last connection to him. I was confident that the rain would dampen any attempt the fire made at spreading. I sniffed and turned around to walk back to my dry home. Robbie. I froze. Someone had called my name. It was almost hidden by the wind, but I was sure of it. Robbie. It was a voice I recognized. I turned around in circles, bewildered, scanning my surroundings for the source. Robbie, please. I stared at the splintered oak tree. I found it. On unsteady feet, I stepped closer and closer still to the scorched stump. I turned my torch onto its brightest setting and leaned over the side of the stump, flashing the beam down its center. The heartwood was hollowed out. In the middle of the tree, encased in oak up to his shoulders, was a small child. It was Blake. Robbie, please free me. I stared in shock and pure disbelief. I could tell my hand was shaking from how much the light danced around. It was Blake, but he's changed. His skin had the same color and texture as dried leaves. His eyes were milk white with a yellow tinge. His hair was a dirty mess, and his scalp was crumbling. He was still wearing the same red shirt he had on the day of his disappearance, but it had now faded to the point of grayness. Despite all this, I knew it was really him. I finally, after all these years, had him back. And he hadn't aged a day. Blake, I whimpered. It's really you. I reached out to try and hug him, but he hissed at me. I'm sure he was scared and confused like me. Blake, please, I'm trying to get you out. Just hold on to my hands and I'll pull you out. Blake let out a long, rasping no before saying, only blood can free me. I took a cautious step back. Blood? Blake, what are you talking about? Bring me blood. Bath me in it, Robbie. Free me. We stared into each other's eyes for a long moment. Then Blake's face contorted into a sickening grin. I turned and ran, straight back to the house. I fell into a glut of mud, but stumbled back to my feet. I clambered up my deck and fell through the glass sliding doors. I pulled the curtains shut with such force, I broke a few of the rings. I tore off my sodden clothes as I ran upstairs. I collapsed onto the bed in my childhood bedroom and fumbled around with the bedside cabinet looking for my zolpidem. I took 4 and turned over for a restful night. For a blissful few seconds when I woke up, I couldn't recall the events of the night prior. And then it hit me. I laid in bed until I couldn't justify it anymore. I got up and made my way downstairs. The first thing I did was grab a broom and clean, as best I could, the dirt and broken pottery on the kitchen floor. Once it was acceptably clean, I made myself a coffee and sat down on the chair that had been turned to face the window. I took a scolding sip and internally debated what I should do as I watched the trees sway in the afternoon wind. By the time the mug was empty, I had decided to talk to Blake again. I made my way out of the house and onto the now familiar trail from my garden out through the woods to the oak tree. Until I saw its split facade, I thought there was still a chance it had been all a dream. Any hopes of that ended when I saw Blake squirming around in the stump. He stopped moving when he saw me and smiled. "Who've come back, Robbie?" I want to help you, Blake," I said in a voice barely more than a whisper. "You can help me, Robbie. Bring me blood." I stared at Blake in disbelief. I didn't know what to do, what to say. Every time I looked at him, I felt this weird sense of joy. I've wanted a chance to see him one last time every day for the past 18 years. Now here it was, and I was thinking about turning my back on him. I couldn't understand what was going on, but I knew what I had to do. Why do you need blood?" I managed to stutter out. "It will bring me back," replied Blake. "Isn't that what you want?" I looked into his blank eyes and saw compassion. It was something I hadn't felt in years. "Okay," I said. "I'll do it. I'll help you." Blake whispered, "Thank you, Robbie," as I turned and walked away. I went back into the house to grab my wallet, my jacket, and the keys. I locked up and got in my car. I single-mindedly drove to the nearest butcher's. I parked on a double yellow line and made my way into some generic corporate butcher shop. The walls were lined with cured meats and pictures of oddly happy-looking cartoon pigs. I leaned over the counter and was greeted by a barrel-shaped middle-aged man who didn't look all that different from the animals he sold. "Do you sell blood?" I asked in earnest. "Blood," replied the butcher. "Well, sure we do. Don't get much call for it, though. How much can I do you for?" I realized I wasn't exactly familiar with blood measurements, so I told him, "I'll take a gallon." The butcher sniffed and disappeared into the back. He returned a moment later with a large plastic container covered in frost. "I'm afraid we only have pork blood in stock, if that's all right." "Oh, sure, that's fine. I think," I told him. "Perfect. That'll be $18. I grimaced at the thought of giving up almost 3 hours' wages for a fool's errand. But on the other hand, my social anxiety prevented me from asking him to get a smaller portion. I reluctantly paid in full and waved the portly man a goodbye. The blood had begun to thaw on the back seat of my car, leaving a stain I knew I'd never get out. I pulled into my driveway and got out. I opened the back door and unbuckled the seatbelt around the container of blood. I don't know why I put a seatbelt around it. It just felt right. I lugged the cumbersome thing out of my car and carried it through my home, out to the garden and into the forest. I heard a dull whispering coming from Blake. He stopped suddenly once he saw me. "Hello, Robbie," he said, as I positioned myself in front of him. "I got what you wanted," I told him, as I unscrewed the lid of the plastic jug. "Thank you, Robbie," he replied. "You're my best friend." I beamed a smile as I heaved the gallon of blood onto my shoulder. It began pouring out in a torrent, covering Blake completely in a clotless crimson. Enough of it splashed on my clothes to make it look like I've been butchering a deer. Once it was empty, I set it down next to the stump and waited for Blake to be free. The blood began seeping into his flesh and the wood that surrounded him. There was a sound like a drain emptying as the liquid receded. Within a minute, he was completely clean. I noticed, however, Then his skin seemed noticeably looser. I stood back, expecting him to squirm out of his oak prison. Instead, his face fell, and her spoke in a slightly lower-pitched voice. "I need fresh blood, Robbie. Bring me fresh blood, and I'll be free." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Fresh blood?" I stuttered. "What do you mean?" He repeated. "I need fresh blood, Robbie. Bring me fresh blood, and I'll be free." I turned and stormed off. I thought I could help. I thought I was doing the right thing. But clearly I couldn't help Blake. Even now, I returned to my house and collapsed onto the sofa in a depressive heap. I felt such a strong, almost unnatural compulsion to help, but nothing I did felt like it made up for losing him. I knew it was dumb to blame myself, but at the back of my mind, I always felt responsible. It's been tied around my conscience since I was 12 years old, and now that I could finally put things right, I was second-guessing myself. Just then, the neighbor's cat jumped up on my windowsill. He curled up in a sunspot next to my box plants. I stared at his furry shape and realized what I must do. Slowly, I stood up from the couch and made my way into the kitchen. I grabbed the largest knife I could find from the drawer and stepped outside. The cat belonged to my next-door neighbor. It was a graying tabby, George, I think its name was. The neighboring family got it when I was just a kid. I couldn't imagine how old he must be. I grabbed him by the tail. At his age, there wasn't much more he could ask for. I brought this new offering to Blake. He seemed happier with it. With the knife, I managed to drain all the blood I could from that ginger ball of hair. Blake opened his mouth and stuck his gray, cracked tongue out as the blood dripped onto his face. He was like a small child experiencing snow for the first time. I felt a warmth deep inside me as he fed. "Is that better?" I asked. Blake replied, "I can taste life for the first time in years. Please, I need more." It was the answer I expected, an answer that I was resigned to. I had my best friend back, and I wasn't going to give him up. The next week was a blur of violence. Usually I had lunch with Lucy, but now I'd spend my breaks driving around town searching for lost pets and strays. I'd taken to using a sharpened screwdriver. It was the most humane way. My findings would stay in the trunk of mine until I could go home and feed their blood to Blake. He told me he was growing healthier and was almost free, but it didn't seem like it. His complexion was even more sickly than when I first found him. His skin was now a dark turquoise, had a texture like leather, and looked like it was slowly falling off the flesh underneath. Seams had appeared all over the visible parts of his body, and they looked fit to burst. His left arm was free now. All he used it for was to play rock, paper, scissors with me. This particular day, I got off work and drove home with a Pomeranian wrapped in a bin liner in my back seat. I began my usual routine soon after getting back to the house. I threw the bag over my shoulder and trudged over to Blake's part of the forest. He watched me intensely as I pulled the small dog out of the plastic bag. I took out my cutting knife, but before I could do anything, Blake spoke. "Why are you poisoning me?" I looked at him, shocked. I tried to hide the frustration in my voice when I replied, "What? What do you mean, Blake? I'm bringing you everything you asked for." Blake's childlike grin turned into a grimacing frown. Now his facial expressions took ages to turn, as if he had to tell each individual muscle in his face how and where to move. "The blood of animals is sour to me now," he said. "And yet you keep showering me in it. Do you want me to suffer, Robbie? I quickly jumped to my own defense. No, no, of course not. What do you need instead? I asked, already knowing the answer. Human blood. Those 2 words directed the course of my life from then on. I spent the rest of the day tackling this moral quandary. First, I attempted to contact a blood bank to inquire about a withdrawal, but I quickly realized how tremendously stupid of an idea that was. The next thing I did was research how much blood could a person lose without dying. From Google, I found that a person could lose close to 40% of the entire volume and live. I decided then that I would try and remove this from myself. It felt fitting, after all, that it'd be my own blood that frees Blake. The next few days were spent preparing. I checked in on Blake regularly to see how he was doing without my blood supply. Not only was he fine, he looked more healthy and normal than he'd ever been. He insisted, however, that going this long without blood would kill him. So I endeavored to hurry up. I made a homemade IV out of sewing needles, a turkey baster and tubing from a long dormant fish tank. I sat down on a chair in the kitchen, the 4 next to me over a plastic bucket. I spent an hour sterilizing everything as best I could with what I had. I stabbed the needle into my cephalic vein and let gravity do the rest. Slowly but surely, the bucket began to fill up. I sat there until I felt dizzy. I groggily pulled the makeshift hypodermic needle out of my arm and collapsed back into the chair. After a few minutes, I managed to collect myself. I steadily got to my feet and looked at the bucket. There was barely any blood in it. I found a 1-liter measuring jug that I'd never used before and poured it in. It just about filled it to the brim. More than I thought, but nowhere near enough. I brought the jug out to Blake, careful not to spill any. His blank eyes lit up when he saw me. I held the jug over him, his mouth hanging expectantly open. I poured my blood and he began to giggle, just like he would when we were kids. His gullet filled with my black clots and it began to overspill, dribbling down his chin and down onto his chest. Once the glass is empty, I let it fall to the floor. Blake began thanking me, calling me his best friend, saying we'd never part. I felt a warmth I hadn't experienced since before my mother died. Wood splintered as he pulled his other arm free. I knew what to do. I leaned in, and we hugged each other. We will never part again, Robbie. I know, Blake. I'll never let you go again. He smelt like death, but I didn't care. He pulled me tighter and whispered in my ear, "But I'm still not free." I recoiled from his embrace. I should have known that he wouldn't be satiated. I had to avert my gaze from Blake. I could tell he was scowling at me. I walked back to the house, leaving Blake to calm down. I slumped onto my couch, trying to think of what I should do next. I noticed my phone on the coffee table. The past few days have been a mono-focused blur. I couldn't remember the last time I picked up my phone. I grabbed it and immediately saw that Lucy had been trying to contact me. I had dozens of unread texts and missed calls from her. I'd been doing my best to avoid her at work. She tried to come round yesterday, and I just hid in my room and pretended to be out. I tapped on the notifications and read through the catalog of messages. All had the same theme, something to do with my well-being. I lay back and decided to give her a call. The phone rang for a while before she picked up. She didn't sound as concerned as I thought she'd be, but she was happy to know I was all right. She repeated what she'd been saying over text, that I felt different, distant. I told her that I was fine, really, and that she should come over tonight. She agreed and said that she would be around at about 7 p.m. We wished each other goodbye until then, and I hung up. I had a plan. I knew that there was no other choice. If I wanted to free Blake, finally free him, then this is what I must do. I put on a jacket and slid a kitchen knife into the inside pocket. I sat and waited for Lucy. She arrived half an hour late, an impressive feat considering she only lived 10 minutes away. I could tell that she knew that something was up. I didn't know what to do, so I blurted out that I had been diagnosed with depression. It seemed to click for her, then what was wrong, and she took to comforting me as best she could. Lucy had always been a tree hugger. She made me try out veganism once or twice, but it never stuck. Hearing about my struggle, the first thing she suggested was that I should get out in nature more. She asked me if there was any place that I felt truly happy. I stifled a smile and told her that I knew a place. My heart beat like a tribal drum as I led Lucy from my house, through my garden, and out into the forest. I stopped for a second, letting her walk just in front of me as we came up to the stump. A few steps later, she saw it. Blake has metamorphosed since this morning. His skin had been replaced with a black mold. The only features of his face, his white eyes and teeth, floating in an inky nothingness. He didn't look like Blake at all anymore. His red t-shirt was gone, digested into his body. Wispy tendrils protruded from all over his body and connected him to the ruined oak that rose on either side of him. He still sat comfortably within the stump, but looked like he was beginning to spill out. Lucy let out a scream that sent the crows flying from their perch. Before she could run, before she could react, before she could do anything else, I grabbed her. I pushed her forward until she was inches from Blake's grinning maw. I took the knife from my pocket and slit her throat. Her screams turned to a gurgle and then ended. Blood poured from the wound and onto Blake, who still spoke with the voice of a child. "This is it," he decreed. "Just a little more." He was still saying that by the time her neck ran dry. I maneuvered her body, trying desperately not to throw up. I cut both of wrists and held her in place as the blood flowed. Suddenly Blake began to bubble. Pustules sprang up and popped all over his body. He expanded, almost entirely enveloping the stump. I stumbled back and let Lucy's body fall. Blake's eyes rolled back into his head and disappeared, along with his teeth. His body had lost all shape now. It was just a black, writhing mass. Two hands pierced the top of the mass and split it open like a satchel. The man began to rise from the black pile, floating up through the air. It was a Native American man. He looked to be in his 60s, although his aura was unknowable old. His legs were covered in intricate symbols of red and white, and he wore a tattered animal hide skirt. Around his neck was a carcanet of beads and feathers. He began speaking in a language I couldn't begin to understand. I only recognized one word: Okias. He didn't even look at me. He kept rising into the air, past the tree line and further still. I craned my neck and shielded my eyes from the evening sun. The man continued up into the sky until he came to a stop 100 feet or so from the ground. His incantations hastened, and he began to vibrate. Suddenly, he exploded into a cloud of ash, which caught on the wind and fluttered away. I clambered over to the stump, but the black mess had already begun to evaporate. There was no trace of Blake. There was no sign that he'd been there at all. There was nothing. I spent the next few years on the run for murder. My old life died with Lucy. In the past 8 years, I've written this account out dozens of times. It is my admission of guilt. Now, I'm finally at peace with it. Make of it what you will. and leave me unburdened. I don't know what I let into the world, but there is nothing left I can do. I love you, Blake.